Hello, everyone. Good evening. I think we can start. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture series. My name is Florian Kübler, and on behalf of the German Commission for UNESCO, I welcome you to the digital lecture series Together for Change, Shaping Transformation Sustainably, which is held on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the UNESCO Chairs Program, and which is organized by us, the German Commission for UNESCO, together with our 15 German UNESCO chairs. Before we start, I would like to do some technical announcements. The lecture is recorded and streamed on YouTube in parallel. And after the short introduction, Professor Jörissen and Dr. Klipatsky will take over for about 45 to 50 minutes. And afterwards, there will be time to ask questions and discuss the topics raised by them. And yeah, asking questions is possible via Zoom and not on YouTube. So to ask questions, please use the Q&A function, in German F&A Funktion, at the bottom of your Zoom window. And yeah, feel free to write down your questions already during the lecture so that we may have an overview or combine questions at the end that will makes it easier to start the discussion immediately. As said before, this lecture series is happening due to the 30th anniversary of the UNESCO Chairs Program, which was founded in 1992 and currently consists of more than 900 UNESCO chairs worldwide. And UNESCO chairs are think tanks who help us to cope with urgent challenges of our modern global world, and they act as bridges between science, civil society, local communities, research, and politics. And in Germany, there are currently 15 UNESCO chairs with very diverse research areas and thematic scopes. However, they all come together under the umbrella of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And with this lecture series, they introduce us to their different disciplinary approaches to implementing the Agenda 2030 and how they become active together for change. Today's lecture is held by Professor Benjamin Jörissen and Dr. Tanja Klipatsky from the UNESCO Chair in Arts and Culture and Education at University Erlangen-Nuremberg. And the chair's research aims to contribute to an understanding of the role of aesthetics, arts, and culture education in a transforming and diverse world. And their fields of work include the development of an educational aesthetic and media theory, empirical research in post-digital culture, including several research projects on digitization in arts education, as well as UNESCO-related and post-colonial perspective. Benjamin Jörissen is full professor of education with a focus on cultural and aesthetics. He is also member of the European Academy of Science and Arts and member of the UNESCO Unitary Network Arts Education Research for Cultural Diversity and Sustainable Development, as well as member of the German Council for Arts and Cultural Education. And he's joined by Dr. Tanja Klipatsky. She is senior researcher at the UNESCO Chair in Arts and Culture and Education, and she serves as executive manager of the Chairs Academy of School Theatre and Performative Education in Nuremberg. So once again, a warm welcome to you, Professor Jörissen and Dr. Klipatsky, and thank you for being with us today. We are excited and now looking forward to your lecture, which is entitled Cultural Resilience as a Responsibility of Arts Education, Scope and Limits of Resilient Thinking for a Pedagogy of Cultural Sustainability. A very long title, but yeah, so please, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Kübler. Dear representatives of the German UNESCO Commission, dear colleagues from the German UNESCO Chair Network and from the European Network of Observatories in the field of arts and cultural education, ENO, dear academic fellows from the UNESCO Network Arts Education Research for Cultural Diversity and Sustainable Development, and from our own university, dear interested artists, practitioners, and students, we welcome you cordially and wish you an interesting evening at our lecture. During the next 15 minutes, we, Professor Benjamin Jörissen and I, will first of all clarify what we mean when we talk about cultural sustainability. And in the second step, we'll give some answers to the question why we propose a concept of cultural resilience rather than just sticking to the already established concepts of cultural sustainability. And to make our argumentations a little more vivid, we link our theoretical explanations to, as we hope, an interesting practical example. But before we start our talk, let us give a special thanks to the organizers of this lecture series, Thank you for having us here. And now let's get back to today's topic. UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay has only recently emphasized once more the crucial role of culture for sustainable development. Without using the term explicitly in her opening speech to the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development, Mondiacult 2022, she highlighted the fundamental importance of culture with regard to the achievement of various of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example, when it comes to diversity, gender equality, rebuilding of peace, protection of water and land, etc., etc. In the final declaration of this conference, the Ministers of Culture of the UNESCO member states explicitly advocate for I cite, forward-looking agenda that fully harnesses the transformative impact of culture. And they acknowledge, I cite again, culture as a global public good with an intrinsic value to enable and drive sustainable development. Referring to the outcomes of the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies held in Mexico in 1982 and in Stockholm in 1998 and other preliminary work, the ministers recommend, I cite, a systematic anchoring of culture in public policies as an enabler and driver of resilience, social inclusion, and economic growth. In this context, the declaration explicitly highlights the importance of enhancing synergies between culture and education, acknowledging the imperative of context-relevant education, which encompasses cultural heritage, history, and traditional knowledge with a view to expanding learning outcomes and enhancing quality education, as well as the appreciation of cultural diversity, multilingualism, arts education, and digital literacy, including artificial intelligence, fostering the systematic integration of culture into formal, informal, and non-formal education, supporting technical and vocational education and training in the cultural sector, as well as investing in the educational and social role of museums, creative hubs, libraries, archives, and cultural institutions, and in this regard, supports the development of a revised UNESCO framework on culture and arts education. This was a long citation, and from the perspective of arts and cultural education, these results and future perspectives are, of course, first of all, a most gratifying and encouraging development. However, especially with regard to the further practical and theoretical development of the field, it will be particularly important in the coming years, not to use terms such as sustainability, resilience, culture and arts education, etc., simply as a kind of buzzwords, but to infuse them with concrete meaning. Referring to these urgent challenges, today's talk will aim to contribute to the theoretical elaboration of the terms culture, sustainability, and resilience, and also on arts and culture in education, in order to subsequently interrelate them by suggesting a cultural studies informed resilient theoretical perspective on cultural and arts education. And finally, we will take resilience education into account as a form of relational, that means transsubjective and collective educational processes that might hold the key to a deeper understanding of the increasingly salient relationship between education and sustainability. However, before we delve into the theoretical background of the aforementioned concepts, let's start with a short glimpse at the practical example first. In 2014, Hendrik Doorgarten, who holds a professorship for illustrations and comics at the Kunsthochschule Kassel, an academy of arts in the city of Kassel, Germany, initiated an interdisciplinary student research project. The core idea of this project was to research a piece of Germany's colonial history and to work up the results of this research in the form of comics and graphic novels. The subject of the study was the so-called colonial school Witzenhausen, a school which has been founded in 1898 as a private enterprise by Ernst Albert Fabarius, a Protestant theologian that existed until 1944, the school, not the theologian, and was supposed to prepare young German citizens for a life in the German colonies, especially in Africa. Since the 1950s, the then newly founded German Institute for Tropical and Subtropical Agriculture has been housed in the former boarding school rooms. And this institute's archives still contain many documents and artifacts on the history of the colonial school in Witzenhausen, which were to be examined by the students of the project. The results of the student research project have been gathered in a book, Raus rein, Texte und Comics zur Geschichte der ehemaligen Kolonialschule in Witzenhausen, which means as much as out in, texts and comics on the history of the former colonial school in Witzenhausen, published by Avant Berlin, a young but already renowned multiple award-winning publishing house specializing in comics and graphic novels. And here you see exemplary snapshots of some of those outcomes, just to give you a first impression. At a quick first glance, the first thing that catches your eye might be the stylistically quite diverse, multi-layered, and artistically quite sophisticated composition of these project results. But the great and interesting outcomes should not obscure the fact that this project confronted all those involved, students as well as teachers, with great challenges from the very beginning. On the one hand, questions quickly arose about the correct scientific handling of the existing material, about the methods like citation. How do we approach the material? What is the best approach? What can we do with it, with the material? While digging deep in the available historic material, the letters, diaries, photos, secondary literature, etc., beside these more formal questions, the project participants also got confronted with questions deeply rooted in the or post-colonial discourses, like who is allowed to speak for people who have once been colonized? Are the descendants of the colonizers even allowed to talk about the history of the colonized? Or is the project per se ultimately a hegemonic gesture? And last but not least, such and similar questions also had an impact on the creative and artistic practice of those involved. For example, the very pragmatic question of how do I, as a white person and descendant of the former colonizers, draw a person of color without getting caught up in prejudice or even racism? With this concrete question in mind, some students chose, for example, not to draw comics, but to use photographs and graphics, or to write fictional newspaper articles and literary texts. Others accepted the challenge, and these are some of the outcomes. Against the background of these first impressions, the question we would like to pose now is, in how far is this an example for a concept of cultural sustainability? In how far is this a project of cultural resilience or resilient thinking? And what do we mean at all by using these terms, cultural sustainability and cultural resilience? To clarify these questions, I now hand over to Professor Benjamin Jörissen. Benjamin, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Tanya. So this is about the term of cultural sustainability and why we would use this term. So the term cultural sustainability has been around since actually some decades in various meanings. First meaning and the earliest meaning of this term is the sustenance of culture or cultural identity. So to sustain a culture in difficult surroundings or in difficult times, such as, for example, during colonial or after colonial colonization, colonial experiences. Now, this meaning changed in the last decade. We brought some examples here on the slide. So culture and heritage contributing to sustainable ways of living. This is the other side of a sustenance of culture. I will dig a little deeper into the question how cultures would refer to their own sustainability, so to say. So, as my colleague Leopold Klipatsky and I published a year or so ago, and I cite from our publication, due to the cultural shaping. So the thing is, what we wanted to say here is that cultures themselves have means to project the future. Every culture has of course different semantics and different means, but it's always about sustaining the culture itself and sustaining the livability of culture, so to say, the liveliness of the people living in a culture. So, and this we would say is a kind of resource. So in this sense, we would say that cultural shapes temporality itself. The term culture designates above all that moment or that aspects of human coexistence which works towards the continuation of life, and necessarily a life specifically understood from a cultural perspective. So we understand culture itself as a figuration that is deeply imbued with sustainability. This kind of thinking about culture is in educational science. It's rather not new. This famous German educational scientist or pedagogue Klaus Mollenhauer wrote about this as early as in the 80s. In this recently translated book, Forgotten Connections, Vergessene Zusammenhänge in German, on culture and upbringing. And he talks about education as one actor within culture that cares about the continuation of culture and ultimately about the continuation of life. So culture itself provides means for this kind of continuation, and thus it provides valuable resources for this. And cultural sustainability in this sense means to prevail cultures, that to prevail cultures also implies or means to save resources to enable future, so to say. So this is another reason why we should prevail the diversity of cultures, as of course in the UNESCO discourses is well known. So the question we would like to pose now is, or we may pose now, how would cultural sustainability be connected to this concept that we are introducing today, cultural resilience? And why don't we stick with the notion of cultural sustainability, which we used in the publication? I just today received the copy, so I dare to hold it into the camera because we're proud of this book. It took quite a long time to get it together, about cultural sustainability in arts education, international perspectives on the aesthetics of transformation. So when we made this volume, we were talking about cultural sustainability, obviously. And today we would rather talk about cultural resilience. So let's start talking about the resilience concept. This concept is known, for example, it's widely spread in many scientific disciplines. I think many of us will know it mainly from psychology, at least in the educational science. This is, I would say, one of the main references we would do. For example, here we can see how this kind of psychological resilience concept is an important one and an interesting one. So I picked out this paper, effects of research paper, effects of musical activity on self-reports of mental health and acculturation of young refugee men. So it's obviously an important research field. Nonetheless, we want to talk rather not about the psychological, and that means in the end individualistic concept of resilience, but we will now introduce a concept of resilience that stems from social sciences, environmental studies, and ethnographic cultural studies. And I hope after I introduce this concept, that you may follow us why we refer to this kind of approach. So we are concretely referring to Katrina Brown. She's a professor of social sciences based at the Environment and Sustainability Institute at Exeter University in the UK. And in 2015, she published this a very, very helpful book, I would say, Resilience, Development, and Global Change. So resilience, as she defined, I won't read through all these slides here. Resilience is, she understands resilience as the retaining of identity through change. That much is, I think, well known about resilience. By activating resources in culturally meaningful ways. So here it becomes, you see the reference to culture now becomes specific. What are culturally meaningful ways, or we may well ask, what are culturally not so much meaningful ways, in a position to that. So retaining identity by activating resources in culturally meaningful ways, so that meaningful responses to disruptive events are created on multiple interwoven social levels. Brown opposes the sustainability approach to the resilience theory approach. And it's important to keep in mind that this is not to speak against the sustainability concept. It's a quite leading and valuable concept. We don't question that. But it's a concept that at least in educational and pedagogical perspectives, has some downsides. It's not so much so very much compatible with the process structure of educational processes. So sustainability science approach is more working towards set goals, of course, like sustainability goals, and of course like carbon oxide values and this kind of quantitative goals, of course. And the way it goes is we have to define a problem, mostly scientifically. We have to define the goals. We have to define the means, the instruments that we will use, and then we will select the most efficient intervention, and then we will work towards an outcome. And this is, of course, on a scale of global politics. This is, of course, the usual way things go. The resilience theory approach on the left side here, left-hand side, is a different structure, but has the same goal in the end, which is sustainability. So this means working to cultivate an attitude of change. It's not so much about set goals, but more the change of an attitude there. Of course, every sustainability thinking hopes to change attitude, but the question is, how do we actually manage to change attitude? So the process is a different one. It's not so much definition of a problem, but balancing identity and change as a default. It's not so much definition of goals, but a culturally meaningful articulation of a problem. So a scientific definition of goals does not necessarily have to resonate very well with different cultural semantics, for example. So because maybe this kind of science would be recognized as a Western science and a kind of science, quantified science, and so this is not necessarily so that from every cultural perspective, it's very that this is very plausible to think like this. So this is more about the culturally meaningful articulation of problems and the activation of cultural resources for change, and these are the resources that are implied in the heritage of culture. Inventing graceful ways of adaptation that let you remain the identity within the change. So the sustainability science approach is more about instructional teaching, as we find a lot of in education for sustainable development, which is a very important new field of education. Our argument is not so much that we would not need this paradigm. Our argument is that it's not enough to imply this paradigm. So we think that we have to find a paradigm that we can put into the educational thinking itself, that works from within education, which is not only something education talks about, but which is structuring education itself. So this is what we're looking for, and this is more about than collective transformative learning, as you have seen with the Raus-Rein example. So there are, of course, a lot of examples of collective transformative learning processes that could be shown that are connected to SDGs, of course, like here in this case, SDG 4, 5, 10, and 12, where a project about green energy for women and youth resilience created jobs. So there, in processes like these, the learning, there's a lot of learning happening, and it's spread all over the place, but it's not that every actor learns the same thing. So at one place, an organization may learn something within processes like these. At another point, individuals learn different things to fulfill or find a special kind of task they can act on in such a context, and so on. Coming back to Katrina Brown's theory, so she did a lot of research and included a lot of research on resilience processes, and she isolated three aspects that we would like to call pillars, so to say, of resilience. So three core aspects of successful resilience processes. And these three pillars, she named them rootedness, resourcefulness, and resistance. So it's maybe not a coincidence that this is an alliteration. It's easier to memorize, but it makes sense actually. So what we now like to do is to introduce these three ideas and these three aspects: rootedness, resourcefulness, and resilience. They always have to work together. They can be, we can talk about them isolated, but only in an analytical view. In practice, they are working together, as may be seen. So let's start with rootedness. What should that be? Rootedness, she writes, is about place, identity, and belonging. And it might act in different ways to both constrain and support capacities to adopt and to transform. So rootedness, she also writes, is the interwovenness of people and places. And at the same time, it's more than place. People are increasingly mobile, so it's about a more fluid set of attachment and multifaceted identities. Rootedness, in the end, is, of course, this is a complex concept. It's important to see it has to do with responsibility. Rootedness is the relationship in which I feel responsible for places and for things that happen to places and that happened in places, as opposed to the postmodern flexible jet-setting individual, for example, that is not really rooted in one place, but that may change places or has a habit of changing places all the time, maybe due to the job that you have in a multinational company or so, where you change places on a regular basis, and it's really very hard to attach to a place. But at the same time, and this is something I think which is a new element, it's not that it's about possession of a place that you would call it your own place and not a place of any other people. It's about connecting to places in themselves, so to say. And these places don't have to be, for example, the place where I have been born. These may be very well other places, especially in our digitally globalized world, where we may build up attachments to places where we have never been, just through knowing of what's happening in those far distant places, which we then care about, and we wouldn't know about them without this kind of media involvement that we have. So this is, you see, it's a complex concept, but it's necessary to build up. So relating to the Raus-Rein project, so what would rootedness mean there? This is a project conducted by students that study at the university. They may have been born in that area. They may have born in completely different parts of the world and came there to study. And what's now happening in this process, that everyone gets involved through the process with the place, with its history. So everyone, the identity of everyone involved in this place will include this colonial history of the place after the process. And this is something which is this kind of attachment. So people begin to care because of this kind of attachment, this kind of rooting. They feel that what's happening there or what has happened there is now their business, as opposed to, I'm just studying here, it's just a building, well, it has a history, but it's not something I would be involved with. So this is a detachment as opposed to this kind of attachment. Second pillar, resourcefulness. Resourcefulness, I think, is the most prominent aspect of resilience processes in all over the literature, because generally resilience means to be able to activate resources in order to retain a state of identity. Katrina Brown writes that resourcefulness is about linking pre-existing assets and capacities within a community or associated with a place to external streams of resources and making sure that these are used effectively. She writes resourcefulness in this respect links to innovation, social learning, and social capital, all of which have been identified as key components of adaptive capacity and resilience, quotation end. So we see resourcefulness is about creativity, and it has very much to do with the virtues of artistic work and artistic research. It's about an ability to make and to craft with restricted resources, the ability to redefine resources, the ability to discover surprising and interesting new connections, which you formerly wouldn't have thought about, to build up new social and social material networks. So by the way, we did a little research during the COVID time on institutions of arts education, and this is what we found, that they built up new connections, new alliances with other institutions, which they told us in the expert interviews they always wanted to, but they never did. But in the COVID situation, because they had free resources, because they couldn't open the houses, now they were able to develop this kind of new connections and make new experiences. So this is the quality of process that we are thinking about here. The capacity of arts education, especially in this context, lies in its ability to enable and to foster a habit of connecting the symbolic and the material, because this is what artists do. It's always a material process, be it in a performance arts where you have props and your body, be it in visual or fine arts where you have the material you're working with. So the connection of the symbolic and the material of form and meaning in ever new ways. We see that artistic thinking and creativity is something you need. It's not enough to just have resources. It's important to be able to translate resources to other kind of resources in order to gain new resources. So you need creative thinking. And so it's about interconnectedness and then social creativity, being able to connect, as I said that already, I would say, with existing resources and skills within a community with external flows of resources. So we have some first example at the end if we have the time for that. But let's ask with our example, Raus Rein. What were the resources in this example? So what happened here is a translation of historic facts through the aesthetic articulation in the form of comics or graphic novels and other art forms of expressions like literature and photography. So an existing archive and economic, cultural, and social capital is used to transform the reality that has been to a reality that includes what happened within this process and changed the notion and the way this reality is perceived in this process. Of course, there was a training also as resource, a training in aesthetic artistic forms of articulation, So these are resources that, of course, you can learn to some degree. And there's another resource, the theoretical backgrounds on, for example, post-colonial discourses and context to other fields of cultural studies. So you see, in order to activate the artistic resources, the cultural learning on a global scale through the post-colonial discourses that taught us so much, and the decolonial discourses that taught us so much in the last decades, especially talking from a European and German perspective. There was so much to learn about this. And this enables a new horizon, provides a new horizon of thinking. And in this horizon, the aesthetic means and forms of articulation can then be used to translate this kind of historic facts into this kind of what maybe Donna Haraway would call a form of science fiction. So, and it's not about starships and stuff like this. It's more about the science-based and the fiction that is made out of that. So let's talk about the last and third pillar, resistance. This is an extremely important and extremely interesting point. So resistance, let's look on this at this photo that is included in the volume of Browns. So this is has to do with the Hurricane Katrina, and there was this kind of this kind of paper attached to in public places. Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, "Oh, they are resilient," that means you can do something else to me. I am not resilient, and paradoxically, doing this is an act of resilience, of course, because it's an act of care that refuses a certain a certain view on oneself, in that case, as a resilient citizen, which has political consequences that maybe are not really wanted. So it's a common critique towards the concept of resilience, that it would have so-called, or we may call this a neoliberal bias, so to say, because, as you know, politics is all about assigning resources, allocating resources, and the more resilient a population is, the less resources you have to allocate. So this is always a dialectic about how resilient people actually should become, and how politics would react to that. This is why, in our view, it's so important to have resistance included into this resilience concept. So resilience is not only, so in German it's easier to say, because we have resilience as Widerständigkeit and resistance as Widerstand. And the resilience as Widerständigkeit tends to level down the resistance, the Widerstand. So, and this is something that should not be. So she's talking about resistance as an important part of resilience, but it's not resistance in the meaning that is widespread, at least I would say, in our maybe public discourses, and especially in the notion of critique as we use it in the educational science. It's not the kind of resistance or critique in that case that is articulated from a distant subject towards some kind of field that you have a view upon and that you understand, and then you utter some critique towards that. For example, criticizing acts of politicians, which may be an important thing to do and to be able to do, but this is not meant here. Here it's more about building up structures. So resistance is not abstract resistance, not just symbolic, not just against something. It's about starting something new, the potential starting point for change, means by which individuals can change social processes and structures and build alternatives. For example, building NGOs or activists in initiatives. This kind of resilience, because the most important thing about this, it builds up new structures. This is maybe more important than the critique that is uttered in the single case. Maybe not. But the structure that arises from that, this is very, very important, I would say. So new subjects arise on the scene, collective subjects like NGOs, that put different perspective on what's happening in the world into the public space. And this reminds us to something which the French philosopher Jacques Rancière understood. He understood resistance as an attitude of what he called dissensus. Dissensus means to not take things for granted, to not stay within the given regime of perception, as he would call it, and the given regime of sense-making. So he says a dissensus is not a conflict of interest, opinions, or values, as we usually understand a dissensus, two people arguing. It is, in his notion, it is a division inserted in common sense, a dispute over what is given and about the frame within which we see something as given. So this kind of resistance brings new ways of looking onto problems into the world. So Rancière identifies the aesthetic politics of the arts as a power that may radically change the order of perception and establish a previously impossible way of seeing. And of course, we are UNESCO Chair in Arts and Culture and Education, so we are always looking at arts education. Arts education can very well help to participate in this power and to cultivate a habit of seeing that establishes what may be called with Rancière an impossible subject, a subject that has not been there before, and now it is there. So, for example, the working class individual in the 19th century that now becomes a poet, which no one has thought would be possible, because there were working class Vereine, working class assemblies that cared about literature and poetry, or the first women to speak at the French Parliament in 1884. And I would say such an impossible object or subject today is, for example, the planet, Gaia, the Earth as a subject and not an object actually, as it may then arise. So there's something there that hasn't been there before, and we have then to deal with it. Okay, let's take the last step and relate this then again to Raus-Rein. Resistance is here the resistance of the subject matter itself, the post-colonial idea itself, implies, of course, a lot of resistant thinking. It's the problematizing, as Tanya showed, of the graphic representations of people of color. How can we do that? So there is something that resists, and we have to work with it. It's a turning away from traditional forms of representation. Different ways of dealing in the project up to the decision not to work with pictorial representation. So there are a lot of resistance processes that build up new ways of thinking and experience. So this is just to remind you, and I'm closing now and give back to Tanya. This is just to, we chose this Borromeric ring picture just to remind you that these are not isolated traits, but they have to be thought together. Tanya, it's yours again, I think. And open your mic, please.
We can't hear you right now.
Sorry, I was polite and muted my mic, so now I'm back. Sorry. Thank you, Benjamin. And dear participants, I'm sure you already have some questions. I have already seen them in the chat and some remarks also. So there will be something to discuss, and I'm sure you would like to post those questions and tell these remarks. So therefore, I don't want to try to test your patience too much at this point, and will only give a short preview on some of our upcoming projects when it comes to researching cultural resilience. In addition to the further development of the educational theoretical considerations already presented by Benjamin, in the next few years we will focus in particular on the question of what methodological consequences arise from these concepts for research and practice. And in this context, we are planning a multi-day international conference for July 2024, which will be dedicated to the topic, especially with regard to qualitative research. And however, with respect to the dissemination of our research to date, we are already organizing several workshops for professional and teachers in 2023, as well as European summer school at the Academy of our UNESCO Chair in Arts and Culture and Education, in which we aim to discuss the theoretical concept of cultural resilience and resilient thinking with teachers, practitioners, and students to directly relate it to the conception of concrete practical projects in order to be able to develop it further together from practice, entirely in the sense of a relational transfer of knowledge, like my colleague Friederike Schmiedl calls that. So this is what we are doing and what we are planning to work further on with these concepts, which are on a theoretical level at the moment, but will be hopefully bound to the practical side too, and to the methodological inquiries too. So thank you for listening at this point. And I'm really, really interested in the questions and remarks coming up now.
Thank you very much, Professor Jörissen and Dr. Klipatsky, for this interesting lecture on resilient thinking and the concept of cultural resilience. Yeah, and once again, the invitation to ask questions via chat or via the Q&A function. There was already one comment in the chat when you talked about the pillar of resistance, and the comments was that dissensus and resistance isn't the same. So maybe you would like to answer that or to go deeper in
that.
Sure.
I would say, of course, these are on different levels. I think we don't want to have now a discussion about the inner logics of Rancière's works or so. He talks, of course, a lot and differences a lot about resistance in his Dissensus book. I think these are concepts on different logical levels. I would really admit that it's not necessarily so that you would have to refer to Rancière in order to explain processes of resistance. I would be sure that there would be other approaches to explain this concept of resistance, especially Katrina Brown does not refer to Rancière. But I think that in our field of aesthetic arts and creativity, this core idea of Rancière, that the whole of the world that we see is driven by a policy of seeing, what he calls policy of seeing. So this is the usual order of seeing, and we always think that this is the whole of reality, what we are experiencing and seeing by our cultural means. And the variable thing about the dissensus concept, as I understand it, is that we then experienced that we didn't see everything, that there was something excluded that has to be included now. And this is an important change that is very, very close to some concepts of educational process. We maybe in English we would rather say transformative learning processes, so to say. So this is an important part where the frame in which to construct the world changes. And I thought I think we saw this in recent years quite regularly. This kind of change of thinking, the way we, I think, even inform people think about sustainability, I think it's not the same like 15 years ago. So yeah, we now have a different feeling about what it really means. When single individuals may have known this from 1972, from the Grenzen des Wachstums, from the borders of, I don't know the English title of that, the Club of Rome report from 72 may have seen it because it's all just fulfilled, like they wrote that. But most of us maybe not. And this is kind of, then we begin to look differently. And I would say what's happening then, this kind of resistance that urges us to ask for resources. So we see then that the way that we deal with the resources that we have, it's not only about using less water, which is important, for example, but it's not only, it's more about having a different view on water, developing a different view. And interestingly, I would say, and cultural heritage provides a lot of these views that are not so much, that we are not so much aware about. today's in our rationalized modern or postmodern culture. And so there's a lot to regain from heritage. So we have to translate these kind of cultural resources and limits of growth. It's thank you. And I think this is why dissensus plays a crucial role. It's not only to be more rational about the resources we have. It's to learn to see and think differently on a planetary scale about these resources. I hope that answers a bit the question. So you're right, it's not the same.
Thank you for your comments. Well, in your lecture, I was thinking, and you mentioned it as well, that this concept, or at least parts of the concept, are very much also connected to the key messages of education for sustainable development. And indeed, it seems to be a concept which can help us to build an education that is modern, that is future orientated, and that is focusing also on transformative action. But you also said education for sustainable development is not enough. Maybe you could once again go into more detail about the extent to which the concept of cultural resilience goes beyond ESD, or where the concept complements education for sustainable development.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think this is a very important point. So as I mentioned, it's not at all in any way against the idea of ESD. It's more that in educational thinking, I would say in educational science, there's a tendency to define special problems because education thinks in Gegenständen, in subject matters, right? So you always teach a subject matter. The teaching method is of course different, but the core of the teaching idea is the same, and the subject matter is different. And then you have to adapt your teaching didactics to the subject matter. So there's a tendency to take everything and make a subject matter out of it. So, and this means to bring it into a distance. And this distance is not really a thing with all subject matters. For example, we have a thing like traffic education. That's a term, Verkehrserziehung. What we do with the little children that learn how to live in traffic. So then there you can say, well, okay, this is the street where the cars drive, and this is not a living space or place for children, and they have to learn this. And this is actually a subject matter. You can learn something about the rules, about the cars, about what to do, something like this. Other subject matters, as for example, digitalization, do not work this way, because you can try to keep it at a distance, but it's already always inside everything you do. So this kind of mediality is always structuring what you're thinking, what you're writing, and so. And it's the same thing, I would say, with environment and sustainability. And so what we are trying to do is not directed towards ESD and not an impulse to change ESD, but it's directed towards the rest of the discourse, not to be confident with that there is ESD and the others don't have to change. I think we should try to think about differently about education in itself, because education as connected to culture has the ability to have its own implications structurally, so to say, within the educational concept itself of sustainability. You could ask which notion of education would make any sense if it's not directed towards enabling future life. Makes no sense. But if you look upon educational theory, more often than not, you won't find this element in educational theory. It's just not there. Of course, this had always to do with some kind of culture. It's more about the openness of culture in educational theory. So what we are trying to do is to find an approach that enables us to convince educational discourse to broaden up, to not think only individually about education, and to not only think cognitively about education, but to think about education at its core, for example, as this kind of resilience process in itself, which is a spread process, a disseminated process, verteilter Prozess of different learning. Not all people in this process learn the same thing. But I would say our task in education is to find educational concepts that may able to describe and make it able to articulate methodologies for research, to actually show how this is possible, to find a way to describe how this kind of disseminated learning processes can be encouraged, for example. And if we look onto, this is a very different discourse, of course, but if we look in the post-colonial literature about non-Western concept of education, we will find this. It's not about that you have 30 pupils and everyone learns the same thing. They have completely different ideas about how learning is organized. And I think there's something to get there. It's not really to replace the way we organize our formal education. It's more about maybe broadening the view upon this in order to have this horizon as an aim of education, where this kind of sustainability or resilience process is possible. So what do we need? Which kind of mindset do we need to enable this kind of resilient thinking process? And I think there are some very interesting examples for this. We didn't have enough time in our talk, so we had some slides with more examples about that.
Thank you so much. Before we turn to the question in the chat, just because you mentioned the buzzwords digitization and also mediality, maybe you could once again go further into detail. What does digitality play? What role does digitality play in this concept? Maybe just to go a little.
Yeah, well, this is interesting. So I'm talking all the time. I would say it's I don't want to overrun Tanya. It's been. If you get me going, it's hard to stop with this guy. Tanya, would you like to take this one, or should I take this also?
Yeah, I mean, you're the expert on the digitalization topic, so go ahead.
Yeah, for example, so just let me give you one example that we like very much. So we like to refer to Jennifer Gabriel. She's a sociologist in the UK, and she has a wonderful project that is called Citizen Sensing Project. And this is about planetary thinking. So she refers to Gayatri Spivak and her talk about planetarism from, I think, 1979 or what? It's can that be? It's not that early, but it's an very early talk that Spivak gave somewhere about why we should stop talking about globalism and start talking about planetarism. And she refers to this and connects this with a different kind of thinking about digitality. Digitality that introduces new possibilities of sensing. I think that you could, it's not really rancière, but you could try to connect this to a desensus idea, because it's a different kind of sensing that connects us differently to the world. So we may see the world. So examples that we had in our slide is, for example, of the Critical Zone exhibition of the Karlsruher Zentrum für Kunst und Medien, the ZKM, Karlsruhe Center of Arts and Media. And Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel, they made an exhibition 2 years ago. I guess it's still online. And there are quite some examples about how digitality connects to planetarism. And for example, there are art projects that seem to be a video game, but actually are based upon some bacteria and data about bacteria that have been planted. And so it's a kind of living data connection. And if you play the game, you connect with this kind of world. So examples like this. But Jennifer Gabriel is more talking about the global, the sensors that are everywhere, sensors about temperature, humidity, pollution, and that are connected to the internet. And so now there's a kind of new sensory apparatus there that we could use to connect ourselves differently to, for example, ecological things. There's also a project on this in this exhibition where you walk through a forest, and it looks like looks a bit like an infrared camera. So the trees are like greenish and with dots and everything, and it looks kind of beautiful, and you're in a 3D surrounding and you're free to walk where you want. And actually what you see is data from trees in Southern America that are sweating because of the heat. So you see the aching of trees, so to say, and experience that. This is what digitality, for example, may do. There are other differences, other examples And I just wrote one down if anyone reads German, in the actual Vierteljahresschrift für wissenschaftliche Pädagogik. And this is about a computer game that has been programmed by an indigenous company in Canada, and it's about sustainable and environmental crisis and how to deal with that, and connects very much to cultural heritage as a resource there. It's not the time now to lay this down, but it's a wonderful example also. We had to decide for an example, and we chose Rheinhaus.
Sure, thank you. So there's one other question in the chat which reached us. I think it's just for the hosts and discussion participants, so I will read it for the audience. Do you think resilience is possible today if we consider how individuals are top down through phenomena like capitalism, globalization, digitalization, focused on nation-state structure for their everyday needs? Who will take that one?
Yeah, Tanya, will you give it a try? So I'm monologuing here. I hate that. I really hate that.
Yeah, you're not really. Yeah, Jacques, it is, I would say, it is deeply linked to processes of capitalism and globalization, etc. So this is really something this is actually, I would say, the big realm we are thinking about when we are talking, and why we have started to think in this way of resilient thinking and cultural resilience, because we have been working on those topics of those transformation dynamics, which are deeply rooted in these aspects you're naming here. So yeah, it is something people could also use, if I get the question right, for their everyday life. This is actually what they should be prepared for at this point. And what we are thinking is that maybe this concept is something we have developed on a theoretical level, but the next step is to do some inquiries on the research side, but also, as I mentioned at the end of the talk, we would like to really make this some kind of heuristic. Is this the right word? Heuristic? Is this the right translation? I'm not sure. To reuse it to think about educational practices and about the ways we are teaching, about the ways, about the topics we are teaching about the way we articulate the topics. I mean, if we are coming from educational science, we all know that those topics we are teaching, or those subjects we are teaching, are not given things, but that we are articulating them in a special way. We are bringing them up in a special way. And maybe this concept of cultural resilience will help, and these 3 pillars will help to think about how to promote and help people develop a resilient thinking attitude that they can take into their everyday life, and maybe prepared for critically deal with all those challenges coming up with capitalism, neoliberalism, etc. So I hope this is an answer to the question.
Yeah, I guess I would just like to add something, because Jacques, you're talking about is it possible? So this is a dangerous way of asking. Of course, it's a realistic question. Is it possible? But can we really afford to stick with what seems to be possible? I don't think so. I don't think so. So of course, it's it seems like a lost battle, so to say, from the start, to try to do this in this time that we at least if we're reading the newspaper, it's always the bad things and so. But I think, for example, what we can learn from ESD research, for example, is that this is a problem in itself. Not being able to believe, to be able to change the future is one of the major problems why ESD is not really translated into different action. Because the feeling that no matter what you do, it won't change much. This is what's really killing the process at the end. So I think we need a sense of the not yet possible, for the sense for the not yet possible. And it's a bit in the core of education to think like this, of course. Education always wants betterment. Of course, we have to find and take the realistic means. It's not just something to imagine, but we have to strive for something that, if it seems realistic or not, that we then try to develop, for example, by means of empirical research, so that it becomes possible in a way. And I think we experienced as one experience in modern cultures, especially, is how many things that we thought would be impossible are possible. Think about microphysics. This is our reality. Now we have these quantum computers, which are kind of impossible to me, but are working. I don't know why. I really don't understand how this works, for example. So the relation of the possible and the impossible, I would argue that has to be a fluid relation, or we are stuck with some gray, dark reality, and we don't want that, or whatever reality you have.
Yeah, maybe I can add something here, because this is really something that I'm talking through with my students a lot when it comes to what can we do as educational scientists, etc., which is really working. And I would like to cite Hans Glöckel, a famous educational scientist who did a lot of school research, and he's saying, well, teaching is always an action towards hope. So Unterricht ist immer ein Handeln auf Hoffnung hin. And I think this is what is really something we never know. Is it really helping? Well, we should try to, the best way we can, to develop most concrete ideas of how to teach and how to make people think in new ways, which is actually something we are relating to why we call it a cultural education and also an aesthetic education, in the sense of aesthesis, which really means that we have to change to bring the world to a change. We really have to change our ways of perception. And also what means that we are having to change what we like, what we feel good about, maybe, what feels good for us, but maybe it's not good for the planet, etc. So this is a broad sense of aesthetic education. I know it's not about the good and the beautiful alone, but it's also something about our taste, etc. And I think this is really something that is deeply related with all of this. And yeah, this is the concept we are proposing, and let's see what happens during the next years.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe also a last question from my side, also in regard with the outlines of your future plans. How do you see your role as UNESCO chair in this process? And how do you use also maybe the international network of UNESCO chairs and the connection to UNESCO itself to promote this concept and to further elaborate it? Maybe you could just go into this a little bit.
Yeah, so we engaged in several networks. So I think you mentioned the UniTwin, Arts Education Research for Cultural Diversity and Sustainable Development, which is now working for, I think, 5 years or so. At the moment, we are in the organizing speaker position there newly and try to find the new topics that we have. So, and of course, we're trying to work with these concepts. So we're trying to cultivate the power of such concepts of thinking, and of course experimenting with that if it works. So we used this cultural sustainability concept back then. So this is referring to an international conference that is, I think that was 2018 or so. It took some time to get the book together, unfortunately, but it's still contemporary. It's still interesting what's there. But so this was 2018, and for my feeling was that the concept of cultural sustainability was not that well understood from the start. So our colleagues were asking, well, what should that be? There's culture, there's sustainability. Well, what do you want? What do you mean? And so, and then it turned out to, at the same time, to be discourse, which we didn't know at that time. So I showed some books. So there's an upcoming discourse about cultural sustainability. So it's now a normalized thought. that we can't have sustainability without referring to culture and cultural heritage and these heritage resources, the cultural resources, the cultural knowledge that is there, the traditional knowledges that we have and everything. But this is still kind of new, obviously. And this is how we work. So we try to propose this kind of new thinking. And of course, we have to care to make it empirically plausible. So the steps that we take is on a theoretical level and on an empirical level. So theoretically, we are trying to develop this concept. We are really starting with Katrina Brown, because in all of the literature about resilience thinking, I thought this was just so inspiring and so connectable to educational thinking. But of course, she's a sociologist, and this is not, we need to develop this further. So we have to ask, what does it mean, rootedness, really? And we have, of course, a broad discourse about rootedness and heritage and everything, the new materialism discourses, for example, that we see. But we also ask at the core of the educational thinking, for example, right at the moment we are about to write a theoretical article on freedom. So what does it mean within this concept? So how do we have to think about freedom? So we have different ideas about freedom in the Western Enlightenment tradition, the Kantian individualistic notion of freedom, for example. So I would say we have to change this notion. But how can we preserve thinking about freedom at the core of educational transformative processes under these circumstances? And this is a question we ask theoretically, for example. And empirically, we have to we collected some examples. Now we have to consolidate this empirical question and also to think about methodological approaches. So with scientific methods, make it possible to do research that is research about this kind of collective learning process that we call resilience process. And this is not so trivial, but it's possible because we now in the methods of social science are quite advanced in this direction today. So we can just refer to international discourses, and of course it's a work. It's the work of translation. So we have to translate these different things from different disciplines and to bring it together. And of course we are working to doing our best to say that this is a thing. Of course, you may say, well, no, it's not a thing. It's kind of collective learning process, but it's not educational or so. But it's always like with paradigms in educational theory. It has to take its time, and you have to show what you actually do mean. You have to show what it means for practice, and of course, with regard to UNESCO related subjects. Well, this is easy nowadays, by the way. We are now living in a time people don't have to be convinced about SDGs or so. It's like everyone gets it, really. And so there's not so much to convince with this regard. So if you do anything, I would say in educational context that connects to ideas, of course, there's also always critique about SDG conceptualizations and has to be also. But I think it's easier nowadays than at any time to make understandable why we do what we are trying to do.
Thank you so much. So it is more translating than convincing nowadays, maybe.
I say it has a lot to do with translating from different subjects, different interdisciplinary views, bringing them together in one discourse context.
Absolutely. There's one more question. I just see it in the chat. Change can be associated with loss, at least for certain groups. How would canon education for cultural resilience deal with subjective collective experiences of loss? And is loss an issue in this context?
Yes, yes, it is. It's when we are talking about, we were a little bit afraid that we don't have enough time for dealing with the whole concept, and we are also doing a lot of research and transformation processes of tradition and transformation. And it's really, when you look at our political scale we have now with the far right people For example, it's always when it comes to heritage topics or whatever, you always have to deal with these fears of losing something, of losing your identity, of losing something. And this is actually something that is deeply related to an idea of culture that is a static idea of culture. So when we are talking about culture and cultural resilience, this is something we would say is part of cultural resilience. I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, Benjamin, but it's deeply in this rootedness. It's an understanding that culture has always been fluid, that culture has always been changing, and that this is a fundamental aspect of culture, that it is changing, and that you are kind of losing something but also winning something. And I think this is deeply rooted in this concept. And in this case, we don't speak of losses. It's more it's more on an affectionate level, that people are afraid of losing something, and not so much seeing what they can win by cultural changes and cultural transformations. And I think this is a part of the aspect, and why especially cultural education should do something on this topic, that people realize, or are able to realize, that this is also something good, and that they are not losing an identity they are afraid of losing or whatever. But this is one of the goals, I would say, that you are learning to deal with the inconveniences of cultural change and transformation dynamics, that you are learning to deal with these changes a lot. So
thank you so much. So at the moment, I don't see any further questions. So last chance. If there are no further questions, I would like to thank you, Professor Jörissen, and you.
There's just one.
One, yeah.
Oh,
it just popped up.
Thank you for yeah. So
Culture is the co-creator of identity. Yeah, we'd be happy to give a second talk about this if we had another 90 minutes. So yeah, yeah, sure. There's of course, identity is always it's a qualia if you think qualitatively about identity, right? There's so many concepts of identity out there. I wrote just some books about that theme in my past. And if you talk about qualities, then the question is, if you think you are something, how do you know this? And what is this something? And there's always a cultural semantics that allow you to define yourself as something, or other people use semantics to describe yourself as a person. So, and of course, co-creator, I would say, creator it's a bit strong, but there you could surely say that there is no identity outside cultural framings and semantics. And of course, then there can arise something new. But this is a matter of dissensus then when culture changes. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And now I wait 30 seconds.
Yeah, but anyway, so we may take the
much.
Opportunity and thank for the questions that have been asked and for the discussion.
And I would like to thank you, Professor Jörissen and Dr. Klipatsky, for your interesting and inspiring lecture. And I'm sure there's a lot to come, and I'm looking forward also to the process of further elaborating the concept. And I can say for myself, there were a lot of aspects to think about, and especially also to think out of the box. And that's one key element, I think. So thank you for that. And of course, I also would like to thank all of you who have joined us here via Zoom and also on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for giving us the time. And our next lecture will take place next Wednesday on the 18th of January. And the overview of all lectures of this series can be found on our website of the German Commission for UNESCO. So please have a look and join us again if you're interested. And yeah, once again, thank you very much and have a good evening, everybody. And thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.